In a world drowning in data, open source intelligence is the difference between noise and insight. I'm Jake Creps, and this is the OSINT Podcast, unpacking the tools, tactics, and techniques that matter to the OSINT community. Whether you're tracking threats, analyzing platforms, or just trying to separate signal from noise, this is your go-to resource for all things open source intelligence. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome to the 5th episode of the OSINT Podcast. My name is Jake Creps, and I'm your host. If you are a new listener to the podcast, thanks for joining us. This is the 5th episode. Go ahead and check out the older episodes. They should still be relevant today. And if you're a returning listener, thanks for subscribing and continuing to tune in. If you are newer, this podcast follows along with the OSINT newsletter. Specifically, the content in this episode is going to cover issue number 81 of the OSINT newsletter. So go ahead and head on over to osintnewsletter.com and subscribe. It's free to subscribe. It's a publication on Substack, and there is an option to upgrade to a paid subscription. The paid subscription will cover a variety of different topics that are found nowhere else online that range from tools, tactics, techniques, and is general tradecraft for the open source intelligence space. Whether you're a new investigator or are a little bit more intermediate, there's a little bit for everybody. So go ahead and check it out. All right, let's move into this episode's content. So in typical fashion, we're going to cover 3 items from the news section of the OSINT newsletter. Then we're going to be covering 3 different tools that I mentioned in the newsletter. And then we're going to do a high-level overview and a slight deep dive in this episode of the paid content found in the OSINT newsletter. And this issue and this episode's theme is integrating LLMs into the intelligence cycle and what that means for you as an investigator. But before we dive into that, let's cover the first 3 topics in the OSINT news section. So the first section I summarize as OSINT growing up. What does that mean? Well, I've been in intelligence for a while, and I remember when they called OSINT classified CNN. Jokes aside, a lot has happened since then, and it is important to note that what is special about open source intelligence is that it's not just a tradecraft or an intelligence discipline that originated in the government. It's been something that has been accessible to investigators across the globe, whether you're on-site, remote, digital, or whatever. It's something that everybody has gotten their hands into. And as a result of that, it hasn't gone through the same systematic and structural approaches and improvements that you get through traditional tradecraft like signals intelligence and things like that. So as a result, things are sort of non-uniform. People can say that they've done open source intelligence and it hasn't exactly been held up to the standards or any type of unified standard. So anybody can claim anything is OSINT. Anybody can claim that they're doing an OSINT investigation. But the reality is you have no way of actually quantifying what that means. And the first section of the newsletter in the news section kind of covers an article by Coalition Cyber that talks about the closest discipline for open source intelligence that can be modeled for a structural approach is probably digital forensics. And I tend to agree. And the reason why I agree is that digital forensics is something that is very close and very adjacent to open source intelligence. It's something that's been around for a while, and it's something that's been exposed to the private sector for quite some time. And it's something that sort of has a nice structure around it. And whether you're in law enforcement, whether you're doing something in a corporate environment, everybody is following a similar type of standard. And I know there might be variations just like there's variations in intelligence disciplines inside the government. But generally speaking, there's a framework that people can start from. And one good example of how this can be demonstrated is that oftentimes people ask me, what is the OSINT course that you recommend for beginners? And it's really difficult for me to answer that question because there is a variety of open source intelligence courses. But the problem is that the nature of open source intelligence is that nothing really stays static for long. So anytime you put a canned open source intelligence course out there, it has a very short shelf life. And it makes it difficult for you to say, yeah, this course has been around for 2 or 3 years and it's the go-to source to get started. And the closest thing I can think of is the SANS open source intelligence course. But the big thing is it has to be constantly modified. It has to be constantly updated. And it's something that it's difficult to say like, yeah, this covers all of the sub-disciplines and all of the criteria within open source intelligence. Now, if someone were to ask me what is the best course to get me started in digital forensics, there's much larger precedent there, and there's a lot of different options that are available that are very comprehensive. I know this is a bit subjective and some people could, argue or agree to disagree here, but it's something that I've noticed over the last decade plus of open source intelligence, that there isn't really a unified approach of saying, here are the minimum requirements that you need to be an open source intelligence analyst. You need to master these types of skills and these types of procedures. And once you've done that, you can consider yourself a novice or even a journeyman in this trade. It's really case dependent, right? If you're a journalist, you're probably going to care a little bit more about geolocation, chronolocation, verification of information online like social media, etc. If you're in law enforcement, you're probably going to be looking more at email addresses, phone numbers, images, doing reverse image search, doing things like that. It's very use case specific, and that's why it makes it very difficult to pin down. I think that this article from Coalition Cyber really does a good job at putting a magnifying lens on it, and it's something that's worth looking into if you're interested in the topic, whether you're writing a research paper or whether you're new to open source intelligence. It's good background to understand, to see where the state of the industry is. All right, let's move on to the second topic in the newsletter. This is actually a YouTube video published by Ben Strick. He's been mentioned on this newsletter and podcast several times, and for good reason. You should definitely follow him on social media or subscribe to his YouTube channel. But this video is titled Top 5 Hacks to Find Deleted Websites, Posts, and Secret Changes. It specifically covers the Wayback Machine, which is one of the pinnacles of open source intelligence research, primarily because information that gets published online doesn't stay online for a long time, or it can change over time. And so you often want to find what things were like at a certain fixed period of time. And if something has been captured on the Wayback Machine, you can often find that information, not only from a visual perspective, but sometimes you can even get the metadata about that content as well. Additionally, if you want to archive something so you know if it's changed or not in the future, you can actually contribute to the Wayback Machine to be able to make sure that you can go back to a period of time with information that was available that's relevant to your investigation. Ben covers a variety of different use cases and a variety of different methodologies that you can use the Wayback Machine for. I actually used the Wayback Machine recently to find information about specific devices that I was investigating. There's a treasure trove of information found on a site that's no longer online. I went to that site and I was disappointed to find that the domain was parked. But fortunately, I went into the Wayback Machine and there's a variety of different snapshots of that website that have been taken over time. Now, I needed to download a file from that site, actually several files from that site, and you aren't able to download files like CSVs or JSON or anything like that from a site that's on the Internet Archive. However, I was able to get information that was relevant to me to be able to find that information elsewhere, because nearly every page of the site was archived at some point, allowing me to at least get clues on where to go to next. Now, this is something that's going to be happening as a pattern across several different websites. You'll be able to find out like, hey, someone said this, and then they changed it 7 days later, and here's the before and after of that specific piece of content. You can also see things, I've covered this in a previous podcast and newsletter issue, where you can see a YouTube video that's been taken down. You can see who posted it. You can see the most recent comments at the time of the snapshot. There's a variety of different use cases, and if you're a new investigator, this is definitely something you don't want to skip over. You're going to be using the Wayback Machine all the time. So this video is definitely designed with the beginner in mind. So definitely give it a look. You can find it at the second topic in the OSINT news section of issue number 81. Just a quick way of getting there, you can go to osintnewsletter.com/81 and check it out there. The last topic in the news section of the OSINT newsletter is going to be about immigration data in the United States of America. It's titled, New Immigration Enforcement Dashboard Makes ICE Arrest Data Accessible to More People. Now, this is obviously something that's specific to the United States, and it's probably not something that's going to be relevant to every single OSINT investigator. However, if you are covering topics like this from a journalistic perspective, or you're doing any type of investigations that are related to what's currently going on with ICE and immigration in the United States, definitely give this article a read. It talks about the Deportation Data Project, otherwise known as DDP, and how they've been publishing more data that makes it accessible for investigators to be able to get insights that they haven't been able to get before. Now, pulling up this dashboard, it's actually interesting. You can get the raw data that powers the dashboard, and you can also see the dashboard as well, including the total number of arrests that have been made in a specific time window. And then you can filter that data and visualize it in a variety of different ways. Now, this is something that's going to be relevant probably for the next couple of years, and I won't cover a ton here just because I tend to avoid political issues in this podcast and newsletter, but I do understand that it is relevant to a lot of people that are doing investigations, especially if you're doing stuff for misinformation online, you're doing stuff that, like I said before, that's journalistic in nature. It's definitely something worth checking out. I always like to see information that's publicly available that also comes with visualizations to be able to digest the information more easily. And it's also a good way of taking a look at how you can take data that comes from public sources and be able to add value to it by visualizing that data a little bit more easily. I mentioned in the past about how if you're looking to contribute to the open source intelligence community, one of the things you can do is you can take publicly available information, you can make it searchable, you can index it if you want to make tools, or if data analysis is more your thing, you can definitely make dashboards and different types of visualizations that can help people out that are trying to make sense of the data that's available. So I always like to add a little bit of creativity or creativity related posts in this podcast. This is probably one of the ones you want to check out to see what's possible with publicly available information. Now let's move on to the OSINT tools section of the newsletter and cover it here in the podcast. The 3 different tools, the first one up is JSON Crack. Now, if you've worked in OSINT for a while, you've come across dozens and dozens of dumps of JSON, whether you're looking at an API's response, whether you're investigating what's underneath the hood of a social media site, or whether you're looking into leaked data that presents itself as a giant JSON dump. It's very difficult to get a sense of what information is available. And oftentimes what I've done in the past is I've taken a sample of the JSON, if it's small enough, and I pull it into like VS Code and I just kind of scan around it. I maybe do some Control F. I figure out, if there's specific keywords that I'm looking for. And then I take a look at that and say, hey, there's information that's valuable. Let me write a Python script that'll be able to parse this information out. And then I can visualize it in my own way. Now with JSON Crack, you don't really have to do that. You can take the information that's in JSON, dump it directly into the tool, and then it'll create a Maltego-like graph of the information within that JSON. And if you go to JSONcrack.com, there's a nice visualization of what that looks like, where it has a specific item, and this one is fruits on the site, but I'll use an OSINT specific term. Let's say that you're looking at people data records, and the field is just people. And within each people record, there's emails, phone numbers, names, addresses, whatever. Sometimes you have to sort of skim around to see what you're looking for, and it's very difficult to see how all of the data works together. Well, with JSON Crack, you don't have to do the whole copy and paste it out, put in VS Code, find what you're looking for, write a script to parse everything out and do everything like that. You can just visualize the data in one screen and be able to present that to people as a form of evidence and show how everything connects together without having to alter the primary source. It's also just a good way of looking at disparate data that is more difficult to wrap your head around to be able to identify the valuable pieces of information. And then it's a lot easier to integrate that into a collection methodology layer. I thought it was a really cool tool, something I hadn't really seen before. I've always run into JSON data and have run into issues with it, especially when the data gets really, really large. This is something that's really cool to be able to, share the information a little bit more easily. So definitely give it a shot. It's JSONcrack.com, or you can head on over to OSINT Newsletter /81. So OSINTnewsletter.com /81. Head on over to the OSINT tools section. Check out the first tool on the list. Definitely something worth checking out if you're looking to build new tools or integrate a new way to handle raw information. All right, the next tool on the list is called Cold Relation. And it's very similar to some of the open source intelligence multi-tools that you see online that are in a web app form. A couple ones that come to mind are like Seon or Seon, I don't know how to pronounce it, and things like that, where there's a bunch of different tools that you can leverage, and each individual tool in the toolbar gives you sort of a form of some sort that you can use to be able to search for information. Now, Cold Relation is interesting because it has a variety of interesting tools you typically don't see elsewhere. It has some basic things that you find everywhere, like domain tools, using things like whois and reverse DNS and general things that you see across different open source intelligence tools on domains. It has things like EXIF metadata viewer, which really isn't all that valuable anymore, except for very edge cases. But what's really cool about this is it has a social media section that covers things like Telegram, VK, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, pretty standard loadout there. But what's really cool is there's a specific China suite that covers a bunch of different Chinese social media websites like Weibo, QQ, and Baidu. And so if you are looking for Chinese open source intelligence tools that you don't need to run in GitHub, you don't need to set them all up, and need that type of skill set to get everything running, go ahead and check out coldrelation.com and check out some of the social media tools that they have. There's a keyword search and also a username search for Weibo. The same thing you can find for QQ. You can find a keyword search for the news section of QQ, and then Baidu as well. You can search for different types of posts that are online. So definitely give it a shot if you're looking for different tools in this area. All right, the last tool on the list, it's not really one tool, it's a collection of references of a bunch of different tools, but it's from a group or an individual that goes by NSCO. Feel free to correct me if this is a very prolific or well-known acronym. I'm just kind of burnt out a little bit from alphabet soup. But they have a Start Me collection, which is no strange source for open source intelligence bookmarks. But what's cool about this one is that they have an entire collection of different types of use cases, and not just, here's state searches, here's federal searches, here's local searches, and just like subsets of the same thing. This covers things like OPSEC, online privacy. It covers the dark web, which that's the one that kind of sucked me into this collection. But it even has niche things like Nordic countries. It has aviation and maritime sources, which is definitely relevant for certain people. And it even has, things like podcasts. I hope that they mention our podcast eventually, and GeoInt, IMINT, geolocation-based tools. And one thing that everyone asks me for is what type of courses are available for open source intelligence. It also has a section for courses and education. So definitely give a couple of those options a try. But if you're a new investigator and you're looking to build out your toolkit, this is a good place to start. You can, pivot through the dozens and hundreds of different sites that they have linked throughout this collection. Find out the ones that really work for you, and add them to your list of tools that you regularly go back to. And you always want to be on the lookout for these types of collections. I mentioned this in another podcast, where you don't want to rely on a specific set of tools or put all your eggs in one basket. Even if you're not going to use a lot of these tools, it's helpful to build some redundancy. So if one tool goes down, you have a variety of other different tools to fall back on. All right, that's the third tool or collection of tools from the OSINT newsletter and the OSINT podcast. That's all we have for the free content in this publication, issue number 81. Again, head on over to osintnewsletter.com/81. It's free to subscribe, and everything that I just covered is going to be free and available for you. We put out a new issue every 2 weeks, and here pretty soon we're going to be putting out beginner content in between the major publications, covering a variety of different things for introductory, material for new investigators. But now we're going to pivot on over to the paid portion of the OSINT newsletter for issue number 81. We're going to talk about it at a high level. I'm going to give you a little bit of the content that's going to be within the paid issue, but you definitely want to give it a shot and check it out yourself by upgrading your subscription and getting not only the latest content, but being able to go back all the way through the archive and checking out all the different paid issues that we have on the Substack publication, osintnewsletter.com. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about integrating LLMs into the intelligence cycle. Now, a lot of content that I've seen online has sort of been like, hey, don't use LLMs for anything intelligence related. It's going to lie to you. It's going to hallucinate. It wants to please you. It's only going to give you information that you want. And while this is true, I'm not going to dispute that LLMs will lie to you in the absence of information. I'm not going to dispute the fact that if you overly rely on LLMs to be able to do your work for you, that you're going to diminish your skill set. And I'm also not going to lie and say that it's going to be helpful for brand new investigators who haven't developed these skills to build a dependency on LLMs. But what I will tell you is that as you go through the intelligence cycle, there's a variety of different ways where you can use LLMs to make you more efficient, to allow you to get information to your stakeholders more quickly and to be more comprehensive with your approach, because the LLMs will give you frameworks to make sure that you're not overlooking any areas and you're not leaning into your biases too much and giving inaccurate assessments or assessments that might be tainted by your own biases and pre-drawn conclusions. I stepped through a variety of different things in this publication, from planning and direction to the collection phase to the processing and exploitation phase, which I always hate why they call it processing and exploitation. It makes it very confusing for people. I like to call this the data transformation phase. And then moving on to the analysis and production phase, actually making sense of the data and what it means and drawing conclusions and giving insights to your stakeholders. And then finally, dissemination, whether you're writing an intelligence report, giving an intelligence briefing, or taking any type of action on behalf of that intelligence, whether it's tactical or more strategic. I'm going to go through all the different areas of the intelligence cycle and how you can integrate LLMs into that workflow. Now, the first thing with planning and direction, you start with some sort of question or some type of intelligence gap. We need information about this email address. Who is the person behind it? That's a question, right? You also may deal with a gap in intelligence. For example, we don't have any insight into any Discord servers that may contain radicalized content about individuals that might be planning attacks, right? These are things that often get sent to you as an intelligence analyst, and you have to find ways to either answer questions or close intelligence gaps. Now, oftentimes you get a question and you get a gap and you jump straight to work, right? Let's get the example of a question. Hey, who's the person behind this email address? First thing you do is you take the email, you extract the username, you attach it to a bunch of other TLDs like Gmail, Yahoo, AOL, whatever it may be. You run all of those into your open source intelligence tools and see if they spit out any information, whether you're using OSINT Industries, you're using Epios, you're using any of these different tools. That's the place you immediately go to and you're off to the races, right? What I challenge you to do is, before you dive straight into answering the question, think about what is the purpose of the question? What are they trying to do with the information? And once that information is provided, what actions are going to be taken? And this is where you can integrate LLMs into that workflow. You can present the question to an LLM and say, hey, what is the best way to disseminate this information to my stakeholder once I've collected it? Or, hey, put together a plan for me on how I can tackle this to make sure that I'm not skipping any steps. Now, I give an example of a prompt and I say, here are my intelligence requirements I've been tasked with. I need to close this gap. We have absolutely no visibility into communications happening in radicalized Discord servers. And I ask it, using the intelligence cycle, help me think through my options in the planning and direction phase only. I really want to think through this phase critically before moving on, right? And what it did is it gave me a 5-step plan, including framing the problem, priority intelligence requirements, collection options, output options, and then typical pitfalls. And it covers things like, hey, what's the gap? No visibility into the Discord servers. What's the objective? We want to identify threats, actors, narratives, links, etc. And what are some of the constraints, right? Like, how do we do this without violating terms of service? What are the risks to OPSEC if you want to engage with threat actors directly? What are some of the rules? What are the timeline that you're dealing with? And what types of legal authorities are involved? This is something that people typically overlook. They just jump straight in, they start scraping and start pulling stuff. They're violating TOS everywhere. They might be operating in legal gray areas. It's very important to take those considerations before you dive in. The next section is priority intelligence requirements, right? We have things like threats, actors, narratives, cross-platform links. How do we even find the servers in the first place? And how do we begin to discover those pivot points? And there's a variety of other things I won't cover here in the podcast, but collection options, right? How to do this in platform, how to do this through, different platforms, like how do you find Discord servers that are mentioned on Reddit, for example, and then how do you find the Reddit posts that mention the Discord servers on places like 4chan or different variety of different sources. What's your collection plan of action? And then once you get the outputs, how do you make this all make sense for your stakeholders? This is something that I asked it to put in a graphic. You'll see the graphic in the newsletter. But that's another thing you can do as well, is like, you don't necessarily need to get a text plan. You can put together sort of a graphic that will help you not only follow along and make it consolidated and concise, but also easy to present to your team if you're working with the team to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Then I move on to the collection phase, and I will not beat a dead horse here, but I've often talked about collection in this newsletter and this podcast. I mentioned issue number 77, using VS Code and Copilot for investigations. This is where I'll cover how you can use LLMs to build collection methodology. And then I will also point you to issue number 73, where it gives you examples on very low touch tools that you can make, like using LLMs to create tools inside of Google Docs and Google Sheets to expedite your intelligence report writing or your ability to process information in spreadsheets. So it's definitely something that is like the first go-to example that I think about by integrating LLMs is building collection methodology. Then I talk about processing and exploitation, which is kind of similar to the collection phase in the sense that everything comes in some sort of format, right? Whether it is a text document that you have, an image you're working with, a video that you're processing, or an audio file. Everything's going to be a PDF, a JSON, a CSV, a PNG, a JPEG, whatever you're dealing with. And you can create tools and different types of methodologies to be able to process that information a little bit more efficiently. And you can use LLMs to sort of build out your kit for that. So if you're dealing with JSON, for example, I mentioned this, you can use tools like JSON Crack, which was probably built, vibe coding on LLMs. You can use different types of specific tools that you create for processing CSVs, right? Merging all of the data together, making it all unified headers, being able to pull out duplicates automatically, being able to normalize data based on a certain schema, for example. Or you might be dealing with PDFs where you're like, dude, I really don't want to open 400 PDFs. Can you take all the text out of the PDFs, dump them in some type of structured format and put that in like a single document so I can view everything? These are types of ways you can process and transform data. And another thing that I call out here as well is you also want to make sure you can enrich that data to be able to find insights among disparate data sets. And this is something that LLMs can definitely help with. Oftentimes, if you ask them to fill in the information that's missing, they're going to make something up. But if you tell them to take information that already exists and help you merge or transform the data based on specific rules, it's something that's very easily that you can do. Then I move on to the analysis section, and this is really the hot take, right? This is the area that's very controversial, is you do not ever want to export or outsource your analysis to an LLM. And it's not for the reasons that you might suspect, that it might hallucinate, which it will. It might, it might take a lazy approach or something that is not really comprehensive, and it probably will. But the most important thing to consider is that you need to be able to own the analysis of your intelligence. If you present information to a stakeholder and they have follow-up questions and you outsource the analysis to an LLM, you're going to tell them, I have no idea, let me get back to you. And you're going to keep doing that until eventually your credibility is completely shot. This is not something you want to do, especially if you want success in the intelligence space. You need to be able to give quality analysis, stand behind it, and have back pocket information about your analysis to make sure that it is consistently reliable and consistently S tier. You cannot do that if you're outsourcing it to an LLM. Do not use LLMs for this. What you can use instead is you can produce your analysis organically. You can give your analysis to an LLM, and you can tell that LLM to critique it, identify the biases that are in there, and show you areas that you forgot to mention based on your evidence collection. This, it's very useful for, is sort of playing devil's advocate against your analysis to make sure that you're not overlooking anything. That's where you want to use LLMs within the intelligence cycle, specifically in the analysis section. And then finally, talking about dissemination and feedback. This is where you want to decide, am I making an intelligence report? How can I make this intelligence report easy to read and digest? How can I make sure that the language is at a level that's very readable? There's a tool called Hemingway app, kind of like Ernest Hemingway, hemingwayapp.com. It's an LLM that allows you to essentially dumb down the language of your content to I think it's a 9th grade reading level. And this allows it to be extremely readable and not difficult and not hard to explain to others, right? Makes it very digestible. But if you're dealing with something like images, right, you can have LLMs create graphics for you. A picture's worth 1,000 words, they say, right? If you have an intelligence report that's just filled with blocks and blocks and blocks of text, Most people are probably going to be looking for summaries or overviews, or they're going to skim the headers and figure out the first couple sentences and get a general sense of what they're dealing with. If you add in images, not only will it block out the text, so you have maybe a couple paragraphs, you got an image, a couple more paragraphs, maybe you have a video or you have a link to a video or something like that, it will break up the content and allow it to be a little bit more easy to use. And then depending on your environment, for example, if you have a little bit more lax of an organization, you'll see in my newsletter, I often use emojis and different types of graphical enhancements to my writing to help the reader more easily digest and break up the content. LLMs are excellent at doing this. I actually got the idea from an LLM. I think Craig may have given me the idea originally with his newsletter back when he was still doing it on Substack Digital Investigations. Check out his new publication if you haven't already. But yeah, it's a good way to break up your text to make it a little bit more readable. And if you have the option to do that, let's say you're in the private sector, you're working, intelligence that's not really scrutinized by the government, you can add that in for a little bit extra flair. So that's sort of like a high level, right? Once again, in review, we were talking about the intelligence cycle and how you can add LLMs. From the planning and direction standpoint, it's a lot easier to brainstorm with an LLM on what your approach is going to be based on your intelligence requirements rather than just jumping in. A lot of times we just get antsy, we want to jump straight in. Then when you get to collection is hard, right? Collection is always changing. You can't just go to the same site every year and get the same amount of information. You have to be able to be a lot more agile and flexible with collection, and LLMs allow you to do that. You don't have to really worry about the tool that you built going down in 2 weeks because you can just build a new tool using LLMs in a fraction of the time. And then you can sift through tons of data and get insights into that data very quickly in the data transformation phase of the intelligence cycle. And then the analysis, it's like your devil's advocate in your back pocket. You can make sure that your analysis is bulletproof. And then finally, you can provide intelligence reports or briefings that are probably the best that your stakeholders have ever seen, based on being able to make it readable, digestible, and most importantly, completely holistic to your entire intelligence cycle phase because the LLM has been working with you along the way. So I did cover everything in the paid issue, but it's definitely worth taking a look at because I give concrete examples of how this information can be implemented. And you can also use it as a step-by-step guide to be able to modify your own existing processes. And most importantly, it gives you a bunch of different references to different types of other OSINT newsletter posts that I've published already that give you real-world examples of how you can implement some of these methodologies into your own workflow. And that's pretty much it for this episode of the OSINT Podcast. Again, if you're a new listener, please make sure to subscribe. You can subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, but you can also subscribe on the Substack publication at osintnewsletter.com. That way you get an email as soon as a new issue comes out. And you can also follow along in the OSINT newsletter written publication so you can take a look at the specific things that I'm covering in this podcast and actually be able to explore them yourself. So that's it. Thanks again for listening. And if you have any feedback, anything that you'd like to be covered, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. I'm here. I'm always looking for different ways to improve the podcast. And as we get things more streamlined and ready to roll, this is the 5th episode now. Once we get a little bit further along, we'll be doing things like interviews and other types of conversations with other people in the industry. So that's it for now. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.